You, Bob. Can you hear me?
I can definitely hear you.
Terrific. Well, thank you. And thanks for everyone. Well, first of all, thank you to the Unitarian Universalist Social Justice Ministry. You're a model for how to live your values. And in my own spiritual background, I think that's what ought to define people of conscience. Not what you say necessarily, not even what you believe, but how you act. I come from a progressive Roman Catholic tradition. I'm a Vatican II kind of Catholic. I'm a pro-choice Catholic. I'm a pro-LGBTQ rights Catholic. And I have always been. And, the social justice doctrine of the Catholic Church is something that motivates me every day. Making the world a little bit better than you found it, lifting up those who need lifting up, a sense of commitment to a broader population, your community. It isn't just about you. I believe that there's a lot of commonality with the Unitarian Universalist commitment to social justice and the more progressive Catholic commitment to social justice as well. I was asked to address a number of things, and the first is defending democracy. We are in the midst, witnessing in front of our eyes, an attempt by the President of the United States in his waning days in office to subvert the freely expressed will of the American people. It's the first time in our 231-year history we have witnessed something like that. And shamefully, 126 members of the House Republican caucus signed on to an amicus brief filed by the Texas Attorney General that called for overturning the election in 4 battleground states, and only 4, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona. And that is, to me, a direct attempt to subvert the election. This is no longer the president sort of acting out his sense of denial. And I think all of us, it ought to have a chilling effect. And it, I hope, also ought to be an exhortation to a call to arms, metaphorically, by those of us committed to democracy, that we're not going to stand for that. Nobody gets to ignore or subvert the will of the voters. That is what is the most sacred part of being in our constitutional form of government represents. I was glad the Supreme Court threw out the case yesterday, but we're going to have to be ever vigilant about our rights and about the rights of our fellow countrymen. So it's a very difficult period of time, and it's really testing the durability of the checks and balances James Madison helped write into the Constitution. And I think we're passing that test, but not as robustly as I would like. And the fact that 126 of my colleagues in the House felt it perfectly okay to sign on to an attempt to actually throw out millions of votes because they weren't of their philosophy. They weren't in support of their candidate is a direct dagger thrust to the very heart of what our democratic system of government is all about. So we need to be on guard, and we need to be vociferous in defending our own constitutional democratic form of government. In a more institutional sense, our Congress, when we took over the majority 2 years ago, the first big bill we passed was H.R. 1, called For the People. And that would reinvigorate the effort to expand access to the ballot and create a firewall against voter suppression that we've seen take hold in many states. Remember that sadly, when my friends on the other side of the aisle took over state governments, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, what did they do? They made it harder to vote. They purged voting rolls by millions of voters, rather arbitrarily. If you didn't vote in the last election, you were purged. They made it harder to register to vote. They adopted very strict voter ID laws. They limited the amount of time somebody could vote early. They made it harder to vote early. In some cases, they all but eliminated mail-in ballots or early in-person absentee voting. So HR 1 would reverse all of that. It would allow for automatic voter registration, same day and online registration. It would protect and make much more difficult the purging of voters from voter rolls. It would expand voting by mail. And we saw the potency of that, on November 3rd. We had the largest turnout for an American presidential election since 1900, over 120 years. It was an amazing thing to see, and what propelled it was the fact that people could vote early. They could vote by mail, or they could go in person and vote early. And we saw an enormous expansion of the electorate. And ironically, my friends on the other side of the aisle who want to restrain that benefited from it. Because although Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won the presidency and the vice presidency, Republicans actually did very well in congressional races, Senate races, and state legislative races. So they benefited from the expansion of the electorate. The idea that it only benefits one party, not the other, is false. And the evidence is as recent as November 3rd. We would restore the Voting Rights Act. You may recall the Supreme Court struck down part of the Voting Rights Act. And by the way, within 1 week of striking down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, saying that it was obsolete, we don't need it anymore. The fact that people of color are being elected proves that. That was John Roberts, this chief of the Supreme Court. Within 1 week, a number of those same states started to adopt voter suppression measures. So the fact that we don't need that protection is simply false and documented rather widely. We would, of course, restore voting rights to ex-felons, and we would institute nationwide early voting practices. So there'd be a uniform standard, at least for federal elections, to give a large window of people to be able to vote early, and it would be consistent. That's part of the problem with American elections. We don't have consistency. So every state and often every county has different rules, very confusing to voters. And by design or not, certainly has the impact of depressing votes, discouraging voters from, in fact, exercising their sacred franchise. So I'd like to try to make sure that HR 1 ultimately becomes the law of the land and is signed into law by President Biden in this next Congress. I think it would be revolutionary in terms of protecting voters' rights, expanding voters' rights, and ending suppressive tactics that actually really impede on the constitutional rights of all Americans to exercise that right. The environment. Today is the 5th anniversary of the signing of the Paris Climate Accords. 186 nations in the world are signatories to it. There's one nation that is not a signatory to the Paris Climate Accords, and you guessed right. If you guessed, it's us. And that's because President Trump decided to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. President Biden has indicated that as a matter of day one, he is going to re-up the United States. We will become a signatory to the Paris Climate Accords and will be aggressive in trying to implement the broad goals set by the Climate Accord, but also setting rigorous standards for ourselves. To put this in perspective, what it means that the United States is not a signatory, we're the world's largest historical emitter of greenhouse gases, and currently the second biggest current carbon emitter after only China in the world. China, unlike the United States, committed to leveling off its carbon emissions no later than 2030. and reducing carbon emissions per unit of GDP by 60 to 65%. Donald Trump, of course, did pull us out, so we don't even sit at the table. I'm also co-chairman of the environmental caucus known as SEEK, or Green Dogs, in the House. I'm a founding member and a co-chairman of that caucus. And I helped pass the largest investment in clean energy in American history and supported legislation to reduce global carbon emissions. In May 2019, the House of Representatives passed the first major climate bill in a decade, H.R. 9, the Climate Action Now Act, which would require the president to develop an updated plan to meet our obligations under the Paris Climate Accord with specific targets. To meet our goals, we have to have science-based policies. Remember that in the previous controlled Congress before we took over the majority, sadly, my friends on the other side of the aisle actually banned the phrase climate change. They actually tried to doctor scientific documents. And when Trump came into the White House, he did the same, so that, scientific papers were actually suppressed that gave, empirical evidence of what was happening in terms of global climate change. A few years ago, I went up to Svalbard, which is an archipelago north of Norway, into the Arctic Circle. And I saw firsthand retreating glaciers, the melting of Arctic ice, the opening up of the Arctic Ocean to much more year-round navigation, and the exploitation that will follow from that in terms of oil and gas exploration, and in terms of lots of shipping. If you're from Asia, and that's why China's so interested in the Arctic, if you can go through the Arctic, you can shave a good week off shipping time, which can save a lot of money and can foster a lot of international trade. But you have to ask yourself, in a remote region with lots of dangers, what could go wrong with opening up the Arctic to lots more shipping through most of the year as it warms. So we need to be concerned. We also need to be concerned about environmental justice. I was very proud of the fact that we did a white paper a little bit earlier this year. My colleague from Virginia, Don McEachin, led the environmental justice part of that paper. But it is all too common that oil spills, coal ash ponds, toxic sites, Superfund sites happen to be located in poor communities and in communities of color. They generally don't affect white suburbs or even diverse suburbs where the median household income is a lot higher. And so we have to address those issues as part of the environmental movement as we move forward. For me, global climate change and environmental justice are top priorities. And I know they will be in the incoming Biden administration as well. We've got a lot of catch-up time. We lost a lot of valuable time these last 4 years in denying the science and denying the reality that's right before our eyes. And that window is closing in terms of the ability of humans to reverse the damage done, but we have to do it. Criminal justice. After the murder of George Floyd, we saw an outpouring across America of the need to address structural racism in law enforcement. We've got to move beyond the idea that, well, it's a few bad apples. It isn't. It is a problem because we've allowed in law enforcement not a culture of accountability, but a culture of impunity. And when bad things happen, the wagons get circled. We protect our own. We demand that police somehow are not subject to the same accountability that normal citizens would be. And I kind of have the opposite point of view. We invest awesome power in a police officer for good reason. And when they use that power, wisely and judiciously, it protects everybody. But when you get instances where that power is abused, and it is documented that it tends to be abused in communities of color, then we have a problem that's structural. It's not individual. And it's got to be rooted out and it's got to be addressed. And that means that we have to hold law enforcement accountable precisely because we give them so much power. And I think that is sort of the debate we're having in America. That's a good debate to have, but I'm a child of the Vietnam War protests and the civil rights protests. I can remember going back to 1968 in Chicago when I was a student and watching law enforcement abuse people exercising the First Amendment rights. Here we are 50 years later, still having the same debates about police and policing. And that has to be addressed. I was proud to be an original co-sponsor of the Justice and Policing Act in the Congress that passed the House. Of course, it died in the Senate. The Grim Reaper, Mitch McConnell, killed that one too, along with 400 other pieces of legislation. But it is my hope in the next Congress we can revive it. That bill bans the use of chokeholds and no-knock warrants in drug cases, requires that deadly force be used only as a last resort, and requires officers to employ de-escalation techniques always first. It limits the transfer of military-grade equipment to state and local law enforcement. It requires federal law enforcement to wear body cameras and the use of dashboard cameras, so we document police activity. It requires the collection of data on police misconduct and the prevention of problem officers from changing jurisdictions to avoid accountability. Right now, because of the lack of that data, a problem cop can just leave his job or her job in one jurisdiction and go to another and be hired by that police force. And we aren't able to track problem officers and weed them out. It provides grants to communities to establish policing reform commissions. I was pleased, I added an amendment for civil forfeiture. Right now, civil forfeiture, first of all, is abused. Secondly, the forfeiture funds go right into the local police department, giving local police departments a real incentive to use that rather liberally. And some would say, I would too, abusively. So my amendment would require that all funds for civil forfeitures actually go into social services in the local community, not to the police department, so that we're beefing up mental health services, human services, housing, and the like, so that because a lot of what police are called to do, frankly, aren't police matters first. They are other kinds of social problems that should be addressed by those professionals, not by our police officers. I also have a bill that would create a special inspector general who would conduct, supervise, and coordinate audits and investigations with respect to federal law enforcement on racial profiling, officer misconduct, use of excessive force, use of deadly force, and the pattern or practice of unconstitutional misconduct. And at the state and local levels, that same special inspector general would have the power to conduct, supervise, and coordinate audits and investigations of the use of deadly force cases referred to the special investigator by state and local law enforcement activities. But criminal justice reform is really important. And part of that, by the way, has to do with drugs. Now, last week, I was proud to vote for, I'm an original co-sponsor of legislation that would finally decriminalize marijuana. Marijuana has been used clearly on a racial basis. We know, going back to Richard Nixon, that from an Oval Office tape recording where he explicitly said, let's make marijuana a class 1 drug because it mostly only affects communities of color. I think he used a different way to describe that. And who cares? And it has been, based on no science, a class 1 drug ever since. It has disrupted lives. Millions of people have been arrested and incarcerated for small possession. And if you're Black in Virginia, for example, you are almost 4 times likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than a white person. So the racial disparities continue right to this day. And the classification of marijuana had its roots 50 years ago in racism, explicitly stated by the President of the United States at that time, Richard Nixon. And so it's time to really address that and to try to expunge records of millions of Americans who were convicted of small possession. In fact, something like 88% of the people who of color who were convicted of possession, it was small possession. We can restore lives and try to return to some sanity in terms of drug policy in the United States. And I think that's why marijuana decriminalization particularly is so important in the context of criminal justice reform. Economic disparities. To be blunt, we can have maybe the best criminal justice system in the world, but not a lot's going to change unless we also look at the economic disparities that still characterize America. And we got to remember the history, right? Poorer communities of color didn't happen by accident. They happened, in fact, by design. If you go back to the New Deal, there were federal documents in terms of housing loans that were very explicit about preventing people of color from coming into your community and using the power of the federal government and the financial power of the federal government to enforce that. We didn't get to open housing laws in America until the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s. That's not ancient history. Redlining was a practice that went right through the 1990s. And discrimination in housing continues to this very day. And we know that from lots of different studies. So looking at economic opportunities, we have to look at educational opportunities. Technology may help us here because broadband has the potential for democratizing education and economic opportunity that flows from it, which is why we have to make that investment, just like we did rural electrification in the 1930s and 1940s. And we've seen the consequences of the economic disparities in America, right? In this COVID-19 crisis. So if you're Black or Hispanic, you are 4 times likelier to get COVID-19 and 3 times likelier to die from it than a white person. And that has to do with access to healthcare, that has to do with overcrowding and substandard housing, and it has to do with the nature of the jobs available to people. And not everybody has the opportunity to work remotely. Some people, especially particularly lower income folks and communities of color, often find themselves in employment situations that require their physical presence at work. So addressing the economic disparities, I think, really becomes paramount after this pandemic experience because, they've been ripped open in terms of an open sore that actually has affected life and death in America during this pandemic. So very important we address them. Social justice is, going to be a challenge with us for a long time. Your advocacy really heartens people like me because I know you're going to have our backs. You're going to continue to push, and we need that. We need strong advocacy to change America. My hope is that over the next 4 years with the new administration, we're going to go bold. We're going to seek transformative change. It's not going to be easy. We may very well still have a Republican majority in the US Senate. And as you know, the Democratic majority in the House is paper thin. It looks like right now on January 3rd, when I'm sworn into the new Congress, Democrats may have an actual 2-seat majority. That means we can't afford to lose anybody. And that means we've got to be really disciplined, but we ought to be. In light of what we've just gone through, I think we have a lot more clarity about our values and how important they are and how important a commitment to our constitutional form of government is. And that commitment means we are ever perfecting ourselves. We are not ignoring or denying or even championing our inequities. We're trying to address them fundamentally. And that's my hope. So thank you for what all of you do. Thank you for having me here today. And Bob, let's open it up for any questions people may have.
Okay, thank you, Congressman Connolly. You just scared the bejesus out of me with a two-seat majority in the House. I don't think we're going to have time for very many questions, but how can we even begin to approach a bipartisan agreement given the open seats in Georgia on the Senate side and now down to a two-seat majority in the House and 126 obstructionist Republicans signing on to the amicus brief? Where do we start? Where should we head first?
Well, let me just say that on the big issues, I'm not hopeful in the near term. So we're not going to have bipartisan agreement on immigration. We're not going to have bipartisan agreement on voting rights. We're not going to have bipartisan agreements on LGBTQ rights. I mean, we may get some Republicans to go along with it, but it's going to be few and far between. Although with Trump not in the White House, it may create some space for my Republican colleagues to show a little bit of independence that heretofore they have not shown. You know, I just want to say about bipartisanship, it's desirable, but the goal isn't bipartisanship. The goal is to move the agenda. And if we can do that with, across the aisle cooperation, that's wonderful. But if we have to do it by, slogging it through with a thin majority or a thin coalition of support, then we need to do that too. We cannot sacrifice the agenda at the altar of bipartisanship. I know you weren't suggesting that, but there are people who talk about it as if bipartisanship were the ultimate goal. It's a means to an end. It's not the goal itself.
Very good. Very good. Well, I think maybe we have time for one more. Let me go up to the chat. I saw one earlier that I guess was looking for optimistically towards the Senate elections in Georgia being won. And would the Democrats seek to remove the appellate jurisdiction from the Supreme Court if that were to happen?
Were we to win both Georgia Senate seats, it means the Senate is 50-50 and the tie is broken by Kamala Harris. That means you can't lose anybody on our side, right? And if you look at some members on the Democratic side of the Senate, some of them are, going to be very cautious about that kind of sweeping change. Joe Manchin of West Virginia, John Tester of Montana, to name two. We may have to sometimes settle for one baby step forward in order to move, to have progress and to move the agenda. We're going to have to manage expectations on our own side in terms of what we can do, but that doesn't mean we don't try always to go bold. I live by a model: l'audace, l'audace, toujours l'audace. Be bold, always be bold, because you got to set bold goals for yourself and try to move every which way you can to achieve those goals. It may take time. We may have setbacks and disappointments. That's life. But you don't give up on the goals, and you don't forget the ultimate objectives you set for yourself.
I detect a lot of Boston strong in that response.
Well, I always say being Irish helps me in Congress because you maintain your sense of humor, but you love a good fight.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't ask you about the Mookie Betts trade then. And I'd like to thank you very much for the time you've given us today. I think you've given us a path that we have to pursue, and I think we're in for the fight.
Absolutely.
So
This is a long-term proposition.
it certainly is. And thank you so much. And your staff, by the way, was outstanding in assisting us.
Thank you, Bob. And let me just say to all of you, keep the faith.
Thank you very much. Have a good day. And now you can go Christmas shopping
Thank you.
on Amazon.